Today's webcast is brought to us by the NASA Professional Development Committee and the Senior Issue Committee, where Andrew Hartnett of Iowa and Claire McHenry are the co-chairs of the committee. Just a few housekeeping notes. We've scheduled 60 minutes for today's webcast. We have muted all audio for participants. Your full participation is asked for through the Q&A feature, which is located at the bottom middle of your screen. If you have technical issues, you can type those issues in the chat, and we'll be happy to have someone get right back to you. When asking questions, please avoid disclosing confidential, privileged, or non-public information. The views expressed by speakers on our webcast are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of NASA, their agencies, or organizations, unless specifically so stated. With those announcements out of the way, we'd like to go ahead and welcome Andrew Hartnett to give opening remarks on our topic for today.
Thanks, Lonnie, and thanks everyone for joining us. In state securities regulators' work, we are seeing more and more scams. We see investment fraud in the complaints that we receive. We see a whole panoply of scams in terms of the notifications that we receive from financial institutions after they've stopped a transaction or paused a transaction. And our investor education message is changing, is trying to incorporate all of the current thinking around scams. And so to that end, Dr. Marti DeLiema, our speaker today, she focuses her research on the factors associated with increased vulnerability to scams and fraud, as well as on the effectiveness of consumer education messages to prevent fraud. And so she's going to do about 25 minutes, 30 minutes presentation, and then I'll come back and we'll have a conversation. So the only thing I want to add before I turn it over to her is if you're going to ask a question as we go along, that's great. But just don't ask it in terms of, wait, can you repeat that or something like that? Because we're going to be asking her that question 25 minutes later, and we won't remember what part of the presentation you're referencing. So ask your question specifically. Please ask questions. Dr. DeLiema, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Marti DeLiema, and I am a professor at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. My main area of research is on understanding what makes us susceptible to financial scams and fraud, and also what we can do about it. So I want to just put this issue in context. So, of course, all of us are receiving persuasion attempts all the time. And when it comes to a scam solicitation or message, there's a lot that goes in, a lot of inputs that might make a person more likely to respond to that message or resist that message. So there's social factors. We might think about that as all the controls that are in place to prevent the persuasion attempt, what messages we're getting from fraud fighters and fraud prevention campaigns. But it also includes things that might make us more likely to be targeted, like how much money we have in our bank account or how accessible our retirement accounts are. Then there's also cognitive factors. I work a lot with older adults. Cognitive functioning, changes in cognitive functioning and financial decision-making over time, that can make a person more or less vulnerable. But the ones I'm really going to focus on in this presentation are situational factors, like really what's going on at the time and place a person is solicited, the social and emotional factors that might drive interest in the persuasion message, and also personal characteristics. We can have things here like our current existing scam knowledge, our risk-taking, our impulsivity. All of those characteristics will influence how we respond to a persuasion attempt. I'm going to go over a couple studies in this presentation. The first one that I want to talk about is research I did with the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, the Better Business Bureau, Institute for Marketplace Trust, and others like the Federal Trade Commission. So our core objective in this study was what differentiates individuals who don't respond to scams at all when they're solicited respond but aren't victimized, so they resist sending money. And then those who walk the complete path to victimization, those who not only engage with the scam, but also go on to have money stolen. So that was our core goal here. Now, our participants in this study were all people who reported a scam to the Better Business Bureau's scam tracker. So these are all people that acknowledged that they experienced fraud. But as you can see from this little pie chart here, the majority of them didn't engage. So 47% were reporting a scam that they received, but they knew it was a scam from the get-go. Let's look at those other two categories. We have 23% of individuals who were engaged and victimized, but we have 30% who were engaged, they responded, but something veered them off the path to victimization. And I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A. So we wanted to first know, among the people who did engage, so these are the folks who fall in the darker blue and the yellow category. These questions were only to them. What made them engage? And what were they thinking and feeling at the time that they received this scam solicitation? And you can see that for those who lost money, that's the yellow dot here, that they were more likely to agree with these statements. They seemed official, maybe the scammer. I was under time pressure. I thought the person was nice. I worried about missing out on an opportunity. They seemed to know personal details about me. I felt intimidated. So all of these kind of mental states and reactions were more prevalent, or there was greater agreement between those who lost money versus those who didn't. And, this is really important because it was kind of showing a glimpse into how people were responding and reacting and really intuiting the message that they got. And we didn't ask this question to those who never engaged at all because, if they just saw a scam text, they wouldn't really necessarily know if they seemed official or they felt under time pressure because there was no engagement with the criminals. So we also asked individuals in this study a series of other questions about what was going on in their life. We administered a small financial literacy quiz. And what we found is that compared to the non-victims, those who lost money scored significantly lower on a financial literacy quiz. They were more financially insecure and faced higher levels of debt, and they were less likely to have someone to talk to when they were targeted. They were also significantly lonelier. So we're starting to see some kind of underlying vulnerability characteristics beyond these situational factors of what was going on in the moment of the scam. One thing that we found that was very interesting is we asked those who didn't engage and who were engaged but not victimized what they knew about fraud from the beginning. And we found that having this pre-existing knowledge about scams was protective. Individuals who knew about the exact scam before they were targeted by that scam were up to 80% less likely to engage. And even if they did engage, they were 60% less likely to lose money. So having, pre-existing scam knowledge that's specific to that scam type, that's really important to keep in mind, seemed to be protective. So the next research study that I'm going to present is a more recent study that was a collaboration with the United States Postal Inspection Service. Now, the USPIS, investigates complaints of mail fraud, and they provided us with information on victim households. So we surveyed individuals that were already identified by law enforcement as mail scam victims. So this is a very different sample. This isn't people who just reported being solicited by fraud and with some victims. This is all known victims. And we wanted to know, do the characteristics associated with that target's vulnerability, like loneliness, online, how often they're online, combined with this other idea of not having anyone available to keep them safe and to help provide a checks and balances, does that increase the risk of experiencing multiple types of scams among older adults? So here is what the routine activity theory of fraud victimization would say. It says, in order for a scam to occur, you kind of need these three things to come together in place and time. This theory was originally proposed as kind of a socio-temporal criminology theory, really meant to explain like street level crimes or property crimes. But recently it's been applied to things like identity theft and online scams as well. So obviously the perpetrator and the victim aren't meeting together in place and time, but they meet in virtual spaces. So the idea is that you have to have a motivated offender, and with fraud and scams, we know that they're all over the place. So we're always being targeted. And you need to have a suitable target who is not protected by capable guardians. So in the case of scams and fraud, a capable guardian could be a friend, a relative, like a spouse, who provides financial oversight, who gives helps with financial advice or just general, knowledge about scams. And then the suitable target factors that we were interested in is, well, is age a risk factor? How about online activity, like if they're on social media? We're also interested in engaging in risky activities that might increase just their exposure to fraud. Do they answer the phone whenever it rings? Do they open all of the mail that they receive, right? This is a mail scam sample, regardless if it's marketing mail or anything. So then we also looked at loneliness and financial fragility because those variables have shown to be predictive in other studies. So we found, first of all, that these individuals who've already been victimized by mail scams have experienced many different types of scams. So 49% of the victims in our sample, and there was 905, their average age was 75 years old, had experienced prize or grant fraud in just the prior 12 months. And the next highest category, 43%, experienced product services fraud, then investment, charity, romance, and friend imposter scams. So this is a pretty vulnerable group as it is. And these questions here were self-report. What's interesting is that many of our participants, over 30%, said that they had not been a victim of fraud in the past 12 months, but we knew that that wasn't actually the case because their information was provided to us from law enforcement. So I see a question that said, should financial institutions be capable guardians? Absolutely. And that would have been a good area to kind of ask about in the survey. Do you have a relationship with your financial institution where you're comfortable asking them questions or getting financial advice? So here's some of our questions. The red arrow that goes up means that variable was significantly associated to a greater number of victimization incidents. Green arrow going down means that variable was tied to a lower number of fraud victimization incidents. And then the blue boxes with an X means it wasn't significant. It wasn't related either way. So we found that a lot of the characteristics that we were testing with a suitable target kind of bucket here were predictive. We found that for every additional year of age, a person was significantly more likely to report more victimization incidents. We also found that they were more likely to engage in risky activities. These were things like our participants entered sweepstakes drawings, they opened all their mail, they didn't hang up on telemarketers, they answered unknown calls, and they also bought lottery or scratch-off tickets. Quite a high number of our participants did this activity. And again, the idea was to measure exposure because we believe that these activities increase your exposure because that's where a lot of scams lay in wait. We also found that they were lonely. They had a kind of a willingness to take financial risks. And then they were financially fragile. This one has been predictive in a number of my studies. And the question is, if there were a sudden emergency and you needed to come up with $2,000 within a month, how likely would you be able to do that? And the question is the answers are probably not and definitely not. So those people are financially fragile. And then those who said probably I could, or definitely I could come up with $2,000, those people are not financially fragile. But we found that these financially fragile people who are kind of living on the edge, don't have access to emergency cash, those folks were more likely to report more victimization incidents. So I talked a little bit about the personal characteristics, both demographic, financial literacy, loneliness, but what about the context? What matters in our environment, our social surroundings that might make us more vulnerable? Loneliness has been very consistently predictive, not just in studies using US-based samples, but also in studies in the UK, in Australia, and in China. So this is a huge driver that might cause people not only to just not have a capable guardian present, maybe they don't have a spouse. In fact, this stat here says 47%, so less than half of women 65 plus are married. But it also maybe creates that unmet need that people are willing to kind of engage with the scammer, start those conversations, And that really just starts kind of the grooming process. We see this all the time in a romance scam. So the other major context that really can set the stage for vulnerability is major life events. And sometimes we might see these happen more often in older adults, like the loss of a spouse. But for others, it could be a breakup, it could be a hospitalization or a big financial downfall. Maybe it's transitions, life transitions, like moving from house, losing a job, just retiring. All of these create like these opportunities. You have to make new routines, new roles, new identity. Like I used to be a worker, now I'm retired. Who am I? And scammers will come in and they will create a premise that really appeals or speaks to that person who's going through that life event. So it's not just the context, it's not just personal factors, it's the context that come together to create more vulnerability. So persuasion and manipulation tactics, how do the criminals do this? So, it's kind of a matter of, it's a numbers game, right? If they reach out to enough people, the odds are they'll get someone who has the right context, the right personal characteristics, the right cognitive functioning, and that person will be likely to be a victim. And they do this using social engineering. So the main one is emotional arousal, and I'll get to that in a minute. They also use urgency and pressure, which can induce high emotional arousal. With a lot of the positively framed scams, we see phantom fixation. So they'll activate these fantasies of wealth and prestige. In romance scams, they activate fantasies of romance and being together and having, the stable, wonderful dream relationship. All criminals don't ever say who they really are, right? So they use false indicators of authority, make themselves seem more credible. They might be law enforcement. They'll even give victims their badge number. They'll tell them to grab a pen and write down this case number. And it's all bogus. It's not real, but it adds to the perceived legitimacy of this interaction. And then criminals are really adept now at isolating the target from potential interveners. And I'm sure folks that work in the financial services industry, especially on the front line, must see all the time people who are actively being coached to lie to them, right? So, and the criminals, that's one weapon that they use to isolate someone from getting help. And over time, and again, this is a very classic in a romance scam, they establish a private and confidential relationship with that person. Don't tell your adult children about us, they'll never understand. So I want to talk about emotional arousal. Maybe some of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And the idea here is that we typically process information using two different routes, routes through thinking. One way is the slow way. It's really deeply thinking and elaborating on that message, weighing the pros and the cons, the risks, the benefits, how will it impact you in the future? And really, that's the way we should be making decisions when money is involved, right? The slow way. But what we find is that emotions can make us actually process information the fast way. The fast way is using just random cues in the message. Maybe the presenter is attractive, or the offer is appealing, or maybe they sound authoritative. So instead of really thinking about the message itself, we're just using these kind of superficial cues to help us make a decision. Should I agree with this message or not? What they find is that when we're in a state of high emotional arousal, and that could be both positive or negative, we tend to process things faster, more heuristically, less deeply. So we kind of bypass that cognitive reasoned area of the brain to go straight to like the quick decision-making centers. And this is really what can get us in trouble. So in my interviews with victim survivors of scams, I hear this all the time. They talk about the state of their cognition when it was happening. So this interview participant thought he was under arrest for missing jury duty. And he said, and they were basically saying there was a warrant out for my arrest and the cops were on their way. They were on their way to come and get me right then and there. And he just said he wasn't thinking clearly. This other older adult, the other one was a younger man, but this was an older adult. She was on her computer when her screen froze, and all of a sudden, there was this loud noise. It sounded like when your smoke alarm goes off, but coming through a foghorn. It was really, 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 really loud. And then this red flashing light came onto my screen that said, your computer has been hacked. Contact Microsoft support immediately at this number, which I did. So again, the first tactic that the scammers used was to get her into this highly, highly emotional state where she just wants to solve the problem, right? And she's just going to follow whatever instructions they put in front of her because she wants her computer to stop flashing. She wants the sound to stop playing and she can't turn it off. So this was, one reason why she said she complied. So I always like to remind individuals when I talk to scam survivors about what today scammers can convincingly fake. So we kind of talked about emotion that they use, but they also use authority. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to differentiate what is legitimate versus what's a scam. So I always tell my victim survivors that they can fake a profile image, they can fake computer warning messages, online bank accounts. They use a lot of smoke and mirrors, retail websites, official documents. I had a woman involved in a romance scam. She said, I know he's real because he sent me a photo of his passport and a driver's license and it matched. Well, of course you can fake a passport and a driver's license and a photo. You can fake them in real life, the actual document. Also caller ID and phone number. So the jury duty participant said it was the local police department's phone number, and that's what popped up on his caller ID. And that just made him immediately start having trust in this call and made him answer it. Versus if it said potential scam or just didn't say anything, he would have totally ignored the call. And then most concerningly today is scammers can of course use, mimic voices and model family members or friends' voices to use in many different types of scams. Oh, and that's the last slide. So I wanted to have there just be a lot of time for conversation today. So I'm going to stop sharing and Andrew and I will have a conversation.
All right. Okay, so we got a couple of questions that came in while you were chatting, so we'll start there. But keep it coming, guys. We're happy to answer your questions. So the first one that came in was sort of playing with the idea of financial literacy and there were sort of two different findings, right? If you were more financially literate, you were less likely to be taken advantage of. And then I'm restating them, obviously, correct me if I'm missing a nuance, and then also if you'd been educated on the particular scam type, you were less likely to be. So are those different or the same things? In other words, when you were talking about financial literacy, are you talking about, budgets and mutual funds, or is that another way of getting at scams?
Got it. They are different. That is a good question. Totally different. The financial literacy questions were like, what's riskier, a stock or a bond? They have objectively correct answers, and these tests have been normed and validated and scored. So that's one separate area of knowledge. And then scam knowledge is another. And you can probably think, well, it's a very different set of drawing on different knowledge. It's like what to trust. And it's your knowledge of persuasion tactics, and just the knowledge of the different premise of different scams. So all of that comes into play in scam knowledge versus financial literacy knowledge.
Okay. And then, so you saw the capable guardian question come in. I just want to linger on it for a minute. When we say that a financial institution should be a capable guardian, you don't mean guardian in like a legal term, but you mean it in the sense of they should be one of the people who can intervene to help, right?
Yes, that's correct. So not a legal guardian. And different studies have tried to represent this concept in different ways. Some studies, like in the cybersecurity world, would think about what kind of controls a consumer has on their own laptops and computers. Do they use strong passwords? Do they have, malware software, detection software installed? So the way we think about a capable guardian, like even in the real world, it can be a security camera. Do you have a doorbell cam? Do you have a dash cam? But yeah, it's anything that can keep us protected.
Okay. Second half of that question was, does that impact people's autonomy as they age if a financial institution is a capable guardian?
I think anytime someone implements more controls or more supervision, it can make it feel like we have someone infringing on our personal autonomy. I would say if you were to have like a balance scale and were to put those on either side, should weigh out in favor of having more, controls and protections. I think most consumers, regardless of age, would say, I want to have my money safe and protected from scammers. But I know that when people are in it, their bank or financial institution, their brokerage firm is usually like their biggest antagonist in this, or at least that's what they're made to feel. But they're made to feel that by a criminal, right? Like it's not necessarily who they were to begin with, but they were groomed, is what we say.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so another question about guardianship, but in a totally different way. Can you dig into the difference in loneliness that was statistically significant versus guardianship being present, which was found to be insignificant? How do you explain those two things?
Yeah, so in one of our studies, we found that and we struggled to where do we put this variable? Loneliness, should that go in the guardianship category? And we did not find like having a spouse or having someone you ask financial advice questions to. Those weren't significant in this particular sample, the sample of victims, but loneliness still was. So loneliness, I like to think of it's like the subjective feeling of social isolation. So social isolation might be an objective thing that we'd put as capable guardians. Like, do you talk to anyone on a daily basis? How about outside your home, right? Where loneliness, we sometimes find very lonely people who are pretty actively socially engaged, right? So let's think about young adults. Everybody has this conception that older adults are the loneliest members of our population, but in surveys, lifespan sample surveys, it's actually 20-year-olds, like people in their 20s that self-report the highest levels of loneliness in our country. So, and they're texting with people all day and are very active online. So it's a feeling more than an objective reality.
Yep. All right, so we got a question on something you and I talked about sort of preparing for this. So did the individuals who ended up being deterred from participating in the scam say what it was that steered them away? Was there a common denominator among them?
Yeah, so this was a survey, so we didn't have a lot of room for open-ended responses, but there were kind of these different categories of people who didn't go down the road to victimization. For some, there was an intervention the study was done kind of during the rise of gift card payment scams. So for some of those folks, it was the retailer, like a cashier. Others, it was their financial institution, like an employee, or the charge was blocked, like on their credit card. Sometimes it was a spouse. Like this was also during the time of the IRS imposter scam, and the IRS, the spouse walked in the house like, who are you talking to? We paid our taxes. What are you talking about? That must be a scam, right? So kind of saved by the bell type situations, you might say. So that's one group. Another group, they engaged, but they immediately knew from talking or listening to the message that it was a scam. But then others actually did start to engage more. Some of them might have even given some money or information. And then they either had a moment of clarity or they calmed down and it was like they could trust their gut. Something is off about this and I'm going to shut it down now. So some people kind of came to their own conclusion that it was a scam. And luckily, at least from this small sample, it looks like that's the majority of us, that we do shut it down before it gets too bad and we send money.
Yeah. I thought the 71%, which is one of the statistics on the slide they're highlighting, I thought that was really interesting. Okay. We have a sort of double question here. What are words to use for the repeat vulnerable adults who just don't seem to want to listen to anyone that they're being scammed? And the other alternative of that is sometimes people are totally in denial. What are some strategies that would help them grasp that they are involved in a scam?
Yeah, these are great questions and ones that we are, currently investigating and trying to find, what is like the magic here in a intervention that is successful. And I'll tell you some different anecdotes that I've heard. So some folks find a lot of success in using the really empathetic response and just sitting with the person and saying, I really want to understand, how this started and what might be happening. Tell me your story from the beginning. Like, let's go over it together. I want to make sure that you have what you need, and I want to, be supportive. So that gets the person talking, opening up, maybe replacing that confidential relationship with, a provider. Some people, the more nuclear option is bringing in family and friends, and they don't like that. But sometimes it has to be done, filing for temporary guardianship, or emergency guardianship. Other people have brought in law enforcement, into the financial institution, having a seat at the desk or visiting them at their house. It doesn't always work, and it can have major pushback. It can they can throw up walls instead of kind of allowing the severity of the situation to hit them. But I always say it's always the smartest approach to start with empathy and compassion and to let the person just talk, before jumping in and just telling them, no, this is definitely a scam, and kind of going through it together. So I heard one gentleman was successful with his dad. He was kind of a chronic lottery fraud victim. And he would go over to his dad's house every morning, and they would go through his mail together. And he would allow his dad to open the pieces of mail, read through it, and then they would talk about it and say, "Oh yeah, Dad, remember that time that you responded to one that was really similar and you never got those gold bars? Like, maybe it's like that." And over time, his dad felt like this new replacement social connection, like going to the mail and opening his mail for an hour was his daily habit. That was an activity. It's hard to break our habits. And it gave him a sense of purpose. By having his son come into the picture, doing this task with him every day, having talks with him, his dad kind of became a fraud victim to more of like a fraud detector advocate, working with his son, being a detective on these solicitations. And it helped break that cycle. So the main denominator, though, that I would say that goes through all of these is time, which is exactly what we don't have and what the scammers are trying to take away from interveners, right? So it's human time. It's like you need staff to just have these calls. And the last thing I want to say that folks have worked that in financial services that might be effective is telling the client, "Can I check in with you on Monday? Can we talk again on Monday?" And having like a planned phone call in the future. And that way it can maybe stop the person from taking any action over the weekend, until they've talked to you. So just promising them something, just like the scammers do, but actually following through. And again, that's manpower. You need people to do those calls.
Yeah. You mentioned time. One of the interesting observations other people in this space have made to me is that sometimes the outcome is different if the requested disbursement occurs on Tuesday versus Friday, where the weekend provides a natural bit of time and natural, sort of de-escalation point because nothing can happen over those 2 days. You and I also talked about sort of your observation that people are, I'm putting words in your mouth here, and I don't like doing that, but sort of more willing to be persuaded when it's a negative scam versus a positive scam. You want to talk about that as part of sort of convincing people while we're talking about convincing people?
Yeah, and by persuaded, we don't necessarily mean by the criminals, we mean by the interveners. Yeah. So I like to kind of categorize some of the major persuasive scams as either using positive emotional arousal or negative emotional arousal. So we can think about like a romance, investment, and lottery sweepstakes. Those all fit in positive emotional arousal. Those also tend to be like longer cons in a way, where there's more of an investment in trust building with the scammers. Negatively framed scams are really different. That's like your government imposter, bank imposter scams. Usually the person is threatened like you're under investigation, you're going to be arrested, or you've lost everything, like the Microsoft tech support. And they use fear. This is kind of an early hypothesis, but I think it's easier to intervene in a fear state because a person is looking to go back to homeostasis. They don't want to be feeling fear, anxiety, pressure. So by coming into the situation and kind of shaking their shoulder and say, it's okay, you're fine. This isn't real. This is just that's not really the FBI that's involved. Your money is safe. You're safe. I think people are more open to hearing that message versus the lottery scam. It's like, oh, you just invested $500,000 and guess what? That money is gone. That people, that's like, no, I don't want to hear that. But, it activates like the feeling of sunk costs, right? So that's my hypothesis, is that we don't see these really challenging victim cases where there's just like nothing you say, no person can stop them in the negatively framed scams as much as the positively framed ones.
Yeah, thank you. So I see a sort of comment, and it reminds me a little bit of the conversation we were just having. Basically it's sort of saying people turn to, or, people are persuaded by scams because of emotion. We're coming at them with logic and facts. It's hard for those, it's hard to talk them out of it when one is in a state of emotional arousal and the other one is in, we're coming at them with facts. I guess I just wanted to note it because I feel like you were just suggesting some ways to try to connect with them and to get past that in terms of listening to their story, that time can help de-escalate that emotional arousal if you can connect again on Monday. So I suppose I don't have a question there. Sorry, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of note that part of the conversation because I think it's getting at the difficulty of that, right? It's not going to have 100% effectiveness, but that's some of how we try to get around
Right.
that issue.
Humans can't reside in that high stress response for longer than like 36 hours, right? You need a break. So if you can delay, I think it's incredibly effective.
Yep. So we have a question about the slide that showed did not engage, engaged but not victimized, and engaged victimized. Were these responses self-reported, and what do you think is the likelihood that respondents were underreporting victimization?
Yeah, so we know that they're not. So all of these individuals already reported the scam to Better Business Bureau. So, and we knew from that original report which of them were reporting a loss versus didn't. So luckily, we're not experiencing underreporting in this sample because they already had made the decision to report a loss. Unfortunately, if we were to just blast the same survey out to a general population survey, we would see way lower rates of victimization. So it's a unique group, right? Like they already are aware that what happened was a scam.
Yep. All right. This is a new twist on something we've been talking about. What training, education, boot camps, or other interventions by regulators, APS, or financial institutions will work to reduce susceptibility? Currently, many blow through warnings, etc.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that the question is focused on the consumer or the clients, right? Not training for the financial institution employees. So there's a couple that are springing up, and all this is really kind of new, hot off the press, new intervention. So one area of intervention is victim support groups, and mostly those are for romance scam victims. Sometimes they can be for other victim types like lottery, investment scams, usually the positively framed ones, right? There hasn't been a lot of research done yet on how effective they are, but anecdotally and in some of the initial reports coming out, those victims do feel, it does help them recover. They get over the hump there. And then there's a lot of kind of co-education that happens in those support groups where victims talk and they kind of co-discover all the tactics that were used that were the same across all of their cases. And it helps them feel less alone, right? And usually they're moderated by a professional. So that's one area of support and education prevention. The other one, there's some work being done out of Wayne State called the SAFE program, the Safe as Prevention program. And they're working with financially vulnerable older adults who might have experienced a scam or referred to them by Adult Protective Services. And they help this person identify areas of financial risk in their life and help them get started on advanced financial care planning. Now, they're not attorneys, so they're not going to do the power of attorney process, but they help a person think about, well, who would I trust in my life to help me make these decisions now, because they might be on a trajectory for needing help down the road. So those are the two that I recognize. But of course, both of these require the client themselves or the victim to engage and to want to show up and want to get help. There's nothing out there that's really been built to motivate the non-compliant victims to recover.
Right. Okay. So, we've been talking about, and presentation was great on factors that make, one more or less susceptible to a scam. When are we going to have this as a mathematical equation where, 0.5% emotional arousal and okay, I can't really finish the equation, but are we at the point of, sort of it being predictive?
Yeah, we're never going to get there. So sadly, the overall predictiveness of our models is terrible. It's like if you can get to a 13% predictive power, that is great. That's not how this works. There's too many inputs and there's too many things that a survey can't measure. Like we don't know, if this person was necessarily sleepy when they got the scam message. We can ask the victims that, but we can't ask non-victims, how often are you sleepy, and try to match them, right? Like the statistical needs and the power you would need and the number of individual variables is just infinite, right? And the other thing is that there's scams out there for everyone. And we find that's very different characteristics that might make a person vulnerable to an investment fraud looks totally different than someone for debt consolidation, right? Those are two different people. And scammers are now increasingly better at tailoring and just targeting those who are most likely to experience those scams.
Yeah, at that point, I think I've heard you say before that there's a scam out there for everyone, or that may be going too far, but something along those lines. And I try to keep that in mind when I'm doing investor education on this front, because there are times where you describe a scam and you can see people going, I would never fall for that. And it's like, maybe not, but there's one out there for you, or maybe you would under the right set of, inputs, unfortunately. So I've struggled with how to message that concept of like, don't take solace in the fact that this sounds abnormal to you, because if you get under the ether, you're not going to realize it. Anyway.
Right, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
And so one of the things that you and I had talked about, and that is sort of related to that, is I think there's a tendency sometimes for smart folks who have not been involved to think, well, I'm too smart to fall for that. And I urge people not to take refuge in that, right? That we always have to be vigilant. Is there anything in the literature that talks about, we've said that financial literacy is helpful. Is there anything more about education or intelligence?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, how do we break through the illusion of invulnerability? Some studies have tried doing like mock scams just to reveal to a person how vulnerable they actually are. Probably all of us work or have worked in a workplace that you've received phishing emails, and they're testing your ability to flag it as a phishing attempt or as spam. And then you might get like, "Well, congratulations, that was an attempt to test. And if you fail, you have to do cybersecurity training." So that can kind of help. The issue that we find in a lot of studies is that there is a major decay in knowledge. So you might correctly flag a phishing attempt as spam, but then or let's say you've taken the cybersecurity training, but within about a month, your baseline knowledge is back to what it originally was. So we find we constantly need to provide like booster messages for people to remember and recall the information. And that's maybe the biggest criticism of big investor education campaigns, is that in order for a message to be encoded and recalled, it has to, be attended to. And our attention is being pulled in a million directions all the time. So it's always better for the scam warning to be embedded in the actual risky transaction setting, or to have that message be specific to whatever the consumer or client is trying to do. Saying things like, it's better to say this transaction is suspicious for these reasons versus an interface message that says, beware of fraud. It's like, okay, I'll beware of fraud, but are you telling me this is fraud, or should I just always be aware of fraud, right? So relevant and specific. Otherwise, we're just going to ignore it.
Yeah, I think that's something I've thought a lot about since I first heard you discuss the idea that receiving education on a specific scam has a, I don't know, I call it an inoculative effect. I don't know if that's a good way to refer to it, but and the reason I'm so interested in it is I think about investor education messaging that many of us have done, that I've done. Certainly, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And it comes from a place of, there's so many scams out there. We're trying to say something that is broad enough that it's, that's broadly applicable. But like, is that good enough to have that inoculative effect? I don't know that it is.
Yeah, and we don't know enough yet to say, how broad can we get to capture as many scam types before the message is too weak, right? One study did do a forewarning where they warned people about a specific scam type that they were then going to do a mock fake scam against them. And the other one warned about a different scam type. So it was a, call center fraud advocate calling these vulnerable households. And they found that the specific scam warning was more effective at a 2-week mock scam. The people were way more likely to just refuse outright. But after a 4-week delay, I believe, it could have been a 6-week delay, the other scam warning was more effective. So it's kind of like, well, what's going on there? Did we raise people's suspicion about, phone call scams? And that's all that mattered. And that's what lasted. That was the piece of information that mattered. Or is it better to be specific? But we're never going to be specific enough because they change too often.
Yeah, I think about that. Some of the things that we try to do as regulators, right, is we want to work with other organizations. We want to work with the financial services industry and investor education messages. We want to work with other regulators. And I keep hearing that in what you're saying, in the sense of, the more people who are delivering the same message, slightly different messages, the more chance we have of, getting through, in reaching people, but also of potentially providing sort of both of those inoculative effects you just talked about. Because
the lasting ones and the really precise ones.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so there's a question about one of the things on one of the slides referred to an increased likelihood of being victimized if you were a minority, Black or Latino, is my recollection of it. Is there anything that that from the study that sort of explains that, or why that is?
No, we don't have a great explanation for that. And other research by the Federal Trade Commission has also found higher rates of scam victimization using law enforcement cases, so actual data from scammers in Black and Latino communities. So it's, I would say that probably the scam types that we're seeing in those communities are very different than the scam types that we might be seeing in, high income majority white communities. It could be a combination of a lot of things, structural disadvantage. Maybe they're getting targeted by like immigration scams, or I know that there's a community in the southern border of Texas that's getting targeted by fake solar panel installation companies. And that community is largely Latino, and all the pitches that these companies are making are in Spanish. So it's very targeted at these specific groups. It doesn't necessarily mean that those populations report fraud at the same rates. In fact, we often find that they don't report unless there's actually a loss. We find that white people are far more likely to report being targeted and scam attempts. But it really takes experiencing a loss for Black, Latino, Indigenous communities and Asian communities to report.
Fascinating. We got a comment in about don't take refuge. Sophisticated social engineers have scammed very literate financial services personnel I know. A couple almost scammed me, so I just wanted to read it, particularly because they're agreeing with me, so that's always an appreciated comment. All right, so you and I were sort of talking about the future and things that that the research is disclosed that are interesting, and what are the next frontiers that you want to research in this area?
Yeah, I think that variables like financial literacy, and intelligence and all of those are going to be increasingly even less predictive because the level of sophistication, the planning that goes into some of these scams is just going to exceed any of our ability to differentiate whether it's real or false. Scammers exploit so many not only errors in human decision making and kind of the thinking fast and slow issues, but they're also exploiting slow customer service at companies and just and our assumption that there are call centers that help us with computer problems in these other countries, so it shouldn't be strange that this person is speaking to me with an accent. So I just feel like their ability to tailor, to target, and to research their potential victims at scale with artificial intelligence is going to make it so we're going to be fighting an impossible war.
Okay, and so how do we respond to that impossible war, right? I mean, does that mean AI versus AI battles to protect us? Does that mean more of the I'm blanking at kind of something guardian? I can't think of the C word that from the theory.
Conservator?
Well, no, I was
Oh,
thinking
capable guardians.
yeah,
Yeah.
capable guardian. Sorry. What does that mean in terms of the future frontiers that we should be thinking about to respond to that?
Yeah, it's going, you might have heard this phrase, it's going to take a whole of society approach. At first we had, this is going to take a whole government approach. And then we're like, wait a second, we don't even have nearly enough law enforcement to handle this. So it will really, I think what's going to happen is consumers will eventually get fed up, or the problem will get so bad for the individuals, because right now most of the loss and the experience of the crime is on the shoulders of the actual clients and consumers. Like, they authorize the transfer, it's their loss, right? And I think that we're going to see hopefully more pressure on the industries that are allowing the fake information to come in. And I'm talking about telecommunications, I'm talking about social networking sites, social media, internet providers. And I think the financial institutions are also going to put pressure upstream, right? Because they're the ones that are having to deal with the angry consumer. I don't know any consumer that's yelled at AT&T, for allowing the first, scam text message to come in, right? So I think together we're going to have to put more pressure on those industries and those sectors to stop the messages from being let through. And that might require legislation.
Sure. All right. So here's another question. We provide from another state regulator, provide magnets and other type of swag to the public that attends our investor education events. Have you found that any type of swag with the agency's contact information is useful? Would it be better to have it just say, think fraud? Does swag matter in this calculus, I guess? Is it a way to remind people of the message?
So no one's separated, at least not in this space, has separated out the effect of, gifts and swag. I mean, certainly it falls in with a persuasion principle of reciprocity. Like, when you give someone something, they feel this sense of like, they need to return the favor. And also swag with like a magnet or a pen or something that you might use or see could help like refresh the message. But we don't know to what extent investments in those kind of giveaways make a difference down the road. The other important thing to keep in mind is the people that are willing to show up and attend your events might not even be the most likely to be victimized, right? Because they're showing some level of, social engagement. Doesn't mean that they won't go on to be vulnerable, maybe with cognitive changes, but, we're already dealing with a more interested group of people.
Yeah. I found that when I was going around the state of Iowa recently and doing some of these presentations, and you could tell that it felt like you were preaching to the converted in a certain sense, that these were people who were already very into this topic. Now, hopefully they're going on and they're spotting things in their community and they're talking to other people about it, and it still has an effect. But to your point, it's probably not the most vulnerable people who are getting themselves to those events.
Yeah, and that gets me to a point where we might want to go a little bit upstream from them, the original consumer. Like, what if we educated caregivers or the administrators of senior living communities or CNAs or, healthcare staff? So, the people that interact with many, many older community members. Law enforcement, for example, needs so much more training in how to talk to victims.
It's funny you ended on that, because one of the questions I was thinking about was that, have you, you've talked to a lot of victims, obviously, here. What have you noticed about the way that they describe the scam compared to the way that, person sitting in the Iowa Insurance Division, describes the scam?
Yeah, well, they totally personify the scammer. They use pronouns he or she and his kids, let's say it's a romance scam. So they're not even at the point that the intervener is at recognizing that it's all smoke and mirrors, it's all fake. These people don't exist the way you know them. It's probably a criminal network running this, right? So you have to reflect their language, or else you're going to be talking over each other, right? So, you don't want to reinforce that it's real, but you don't want to discount like the reality to them.
Right, right. So we just got a question about, we've talked a lot about older adults today. How do you recommend talking to the younger 20-somethings about fraud?
Yeah, this is a group that's been really overlooked, but we find that they are so vulnerable, especially to like employment scams, and it totally catches them off guard. They're like, and they feel so ashamed because they're like, isn't this something that happens to older people? So I would really tailor the conversation to the type of scams that young people see, not, the other scams. Maybe it'd be cryptocurrencies and other things. And I would always lead with stories, right? The other really concerning thing that's happening to young people is sextortion. That's a really, really problematic subtype of fraud and crime, even to kids as young as 12 and 13. I think we need to do way better about keeping people and children and teenagers safe in online contexts. But I would start with tailoring it to the scams that their groups are seeing.
Yep. 60 or a 14-year-old's probably not getting the toll booth scam the way that I am.
Exactly.
Though I've even gotten that one on my professional phone where it's allegedly the state of Iowa contacting me on a state of Iowa phone. But what are you going to do? You referenced cybersecurity and those kinds of scams. I found one during the hour that you and I have been chatting, where somebody wanted me to click and do an inventory, and it was not from our office. So we're all potential victims, right?
Exactly.
And ironically, to some of the situational factors, it didn't occur to me that it might be a scam when I saw it on my phone. It was only when I got back to my office, I'm like, wait a second, that doesn't look at that email address doesn't sound right. So
Yeah, if you're distracted or just busy or stressed or tired, all of those things can set you up.
yep. All right, I don't think, if I didn't get to your question, I apologize. That was my fault. This has been a really great conversation. Do you have closing thoughts on scams? That may be the worst question I've ever asked, but anything you wanna add before we end our interesting conversation?
Well, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining. And this is again probably preaching to the converted, but we can all take this information and bring it back to our colleagues and our families, and hopefully pass it on.
Thank you very much. All right, that's all for us. Thank you, Dr. Marti DeLiema.
Thank you. Bye.